Hey art folks, it's Sadie, and today I have for you a cheap versus expensive art supply challenge. So this is going to be a little different than most of these because I actually have what I consider 3 different grades of art supplies. And we're going to start with the lowest grade, which I'm calling basic. So for the basic art supplies, I have watercolor paints from Home Hobby by 3L. The kit costs $45 USD, but I think that you can get basically the same quality of watercolor paints at the dollar store. It comes with 12 paints, a plastic round palette, and 10 sheets of 300 GSM cold pressed watercolor paper, as well as a set of 5 brushes, one of which came broken, and all of which were kind of crooked. So for all of the different grades, I am painting an iris, and that was inspired actually by the Home Hobby watercolor kit. I wanted to try my hand at painting my own style of iris, and I actually have the tutorial if you want to learn how to paint this iris too in the description below. And also it's available for free for my Patreons. So why do I call this basic? You're probably used to the 2 grades, student grade watercolor and professional grade watercolor. But there is, I feel like, another level that is below student grade, because I don't think it's really fair to have Schmincke-Horadam on one end and then Winsor Newton and Cotman and say that all watercolors below this are the same. I think that there is a certain type of watercolor that you can get at the dollar store that is on a different kind of level by itself. These types of watercolors have little or no information about pigments or light fastness, and actually they basically don't really perform in the way that watercolor normally does. When I was painting with these paints, I kind of struggled a lot, and I feel like these kind of paints can make you feel like you don't know how to paint, even if you do, because you're fighting with them all the time. At first, they seem okay because one layer is fine. The brightness is fine. These days, the saturation of a color is not necessarily an indicator of the quality of the paints like they were back in the day. But one of the things you can notice even early on is that they don't really flow when you put them wet into wet. They just kind of sit on the page. And then when you actually try to mix the colors, they mix very muddily and you don't get crisp, clean, clear colors. It's really hard to get something nice and vibrant. And then as I kept painting with these paints, the biggest thing that you always come up against is the layering. If you don't layer very much, it's not going to be a big problem, but I layer a lot. And these paints do not like that. They don't really want to sit on top of each other. They kind of lift. If you put a wet layer on top of another one, all of the details underneath disappear. And it's also really difficult to get a depth of color, to get something really deep, dark, and vibrant without losing all of your saturation and going really dull. I also realized that I had to keep mixing up pools of color because I would just use them all trying to paint. There just isn't enough pigment or dye or color in these paints to go a long way. Even for a small painting like this, I used a decent amount of paint. The texture of these paints was kind of gooey, not really like watercolor. And then in the end, when they were dry, they had this really dull and chalky appearance. Not so fun. About the paper, since this was actually 300 GSM paper, it actually did not perform too bad. It was nice and sturdy and thick and dried totally flat. That was really cool. The biggest problem with this paper and with lower grade papers is that it started to deteriorate as I added more and more layers. It eventually just was not having it, and even though I was being as gentle as I could see the damage on the paper. If you don't layer a ton like I do, then it's not a problem. But if you do, you're gonna want to look for higher quality paper. The paper also didn't want to hold water for very long, which made it a little more difficult to get nice smooth transitions. But it did make it faster because you didn't have to wait for the paper to dry. But in the end, I was able to make a painting. I think you really can make a painting with any quality of art supplies if you are determined enough. So the next grade is your student grade. For this, I'm using the Winsor & Newton Cotman Compact Set. The brushes that I used were the Silver Black Velvet Squirrel Synthetic Mix brush and also a Cosmotop Spin from DaVinci, but only for details. It was so nice being able to use a higher grade brush because I wasn't dealing with these crooked brushes. For the black velvet brush, the combination of squirrel and synthetic means that it has the softness and the liquid carrying capabilities of squirrel hair, but also the springiness and stiffness of a synthetic fiber. So that's a good combination and a nice cost savings because it's cheaper than if you wanted to get that springiness and water carrying in a Kolinsky brush. This was really great for laying down water in a place where I was starting a wet and wet wash. And since the squirrel brush holds so much water, you can also take tons of water out, and then it is a perfect thirsty brush. The Cosmotop from DaVinci was also really great for putting in the details. Since it's a little higher grade than the previous synthetic brushes I was using, it holds a bit more water even though it's super tiny. And since it's synthetic, it stays nice and hard for a thin line. The paper I used for student grade was 150 GSM Bockingford paper. This is a cellulose paper, just like the other one, but it's actually a lower weight. And this is a thing that surprised me because I actually really love Bockingford, and I expected it would blow the previous paper out of the water. But this is where you learn that weight really does matter. It buckled a lot and seemed to struggle a bit with the amount of water that I had on the paper sometimes. And I definitely don't think that would have happened if I had the 300 GSM Bockingford. Still, it did not deteriorate as I put on more and more layers, so that still means that it is higher quality. And it also was wet much longer than the other paper. So the famous Winsor & Newton Cotman set. This is about $20. You can't get this at the dollar store unless you have, I guess, a really fancy dollar store near you. It's no longer a dollar store, that's a Target or something. I have these memories of using this exact kit way back when I was a young girl and being so frustrated by it. But after using the previous basic level watercolors, this felt so nice because even if they're not at professional grade, they still behave like watercolors. Colors are much brighter, they mix much more cleanly, they're much more transparent, they do not have any problem with layering, and the colors actually want to flow together without me having to push them together. The downsides that I did notice about this is that I still had to use a lot of paint. Not as much paint as I did with the basic level watercolors, but definitely more than I am used to with my professional grade watercolors. One of these pans was brand new, and by the time I had finished this pretty small painting, it had a decent sized dent in it. And even though the paints were not chalky looking in the end, unlike the basic level watercolors, you can see when you're mixing that there is a decent amount of fillers in the paint. But overall, honestly, if I had to paint with these on a regular basis, I would have no problem doing that. These are a good paint, and I think a good place for anyone to start. Finally, the professional level of watercolor supplies. For this, I am using my main palette, which has probably $200 to $300 worth of professional grade watercolor paints from Schmincke, Rembrandt, Old Holland, Core, Daniel Smith, everybody. But first, let's talk about the brushes. This big brush that I'm using here is a Kolinsky Squirrel Mop from DaVinci, and that by itself is around $80. Most of the brushes that I'm using for this level are Kolinsky Squirrel, which is a brush that both has a good water carrying capability and a good snap. These brushes all have great points and good water control, so they basically do everything perfectly. I haven't found any synthetic brushes that perform the same way, and I wish I could. The really nice thing about these brushes is that they can go from a literal hairline length to a big wash, just based on the pressure of your hand. So I can use them to put down water and also to get into super tiny little areas with no effort at all. One of the brushes that I also use is just a plain squirrel mop, not like the squirrel mix I used in the student grade, but just a pure Kazan squirrel mop. And this is even more thirsty than the squirrel mix and is great for lifting and makes these beautiful soft transitions. The paper that I'm using is the Lanaquarelle 300 GSM cold pressed 100% cotton watercolor paper. This was definitely the best of the papers. I have been trying to find a substitute for Fabriano Artistico and trying a bunch of different brands, and I came across this one and I have been enjoying painting on it. There is no issue with buckling, no issue with the paper deteriorating, no issue with layers, and the paint remains nice, crisp, and vibrant, and it has a nice texture to the cold press. So, about the paints. It was so funny because I was shocked by my own paints. After going through painting with the basic and then the student, I got used to that level of quality. And then when I went back to these professional paints, it felt like I had my training wheels taken off and I was about to fall. There was so much intensity when I put down just a little bit of paint. I didn't know how to control it. So I can definitely see that if you're a beginner and the paint is just going wild for you, a student grade paint might help you learn how to control the paint a bit more first. And it even took me a little while to get back into the rhythm of using these more intense paints. The colors are much, much more transparent than the student grade paints or the basic paints. You can get these clear, crisp glazes with no effort at all. It's really easy to mix colors because professional grade paints also have pigments that are generally not available in student grade paints. For example, I had to dull down the purple a bit with either some green or some red in the previous two grades in order to make the very dark purple. But in this one, I was simply able to use indanthrone blue and perylene maroon to make a very deep purple. And that was able to be very saturated, wild deep. The colors layer very easily. You can put wet washes on top of wet washes and everything won't disappear underneath. And I really used very little paint. I was so used to mixing up so much paint for the previous grades that I ended up just mixing up way too much paint. I did not need all of that by the end of the painting. So you might consider the other two grades cost effective, but when you consider how much paint you actually need to use, I don't know how cost effective it is. I was also able to paint much faster because I was not struggling with my paints. My paints were working with me, and I was also just having way more fun and way happier overall. So what do you think about these three different irises? Do you see a big difference? To me, it is so clear, like night and day, all of the different grades. But I don't know if you see it like I do. Do you? I really do think that it's worth it if you can afford professional quality watercolor paints, because Especially after doing these 3 different grades, it's really clear to me that they perform better. But you can also see that you can make a pretty detailed and beautiful painting from any level of these supplies if you try hard enough. Obviously, it is not necessary to have the highest grade paints, and I don't recommend anyone have as many paints as I have. But if you are really interested in watercolors, I really recommend starting at least with student grade paint, because it's not going to be as much of a struggle as the basic level paints. What do you think? Where did you start? Where do you wish you started? And is there something else that you would like to try? Do you think that professional grade paints are worth it? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to my patrons. I love you guys so much. And like I said, you are going to get a tutorial about how to paint this fairy iris if you are a $5 patron and higher. And if you're not a patron, you'll be able to purchase this tutorial. I hope this was informative. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and ring that bell. See you guys next time. And until then, be gentle with yourself. Bye.